As the Clone Wars ended, along with the reign of the Galactic Republic, Palpatine's plans shifted to his next phase. He spent years plotting a coup so massive he literally took over a galaxy and ended an ancient order of peacekeepers with mystical powers. The next part of his plan was keeping that power and crushing any small pockets that didn't go along with his new order. To accomplish this, Grand Moff Tarkin made a declaration for the galaxy that would be known as the Tarkin Doctrine, or the Doctrine of Fear. A major part of this was a policy of overwhelming force and psychological dominance. The AT-AT, or All-Terrain Armored Transport, I don't like AT-AT, was the official successor of the AT-TE, used during the Clone Wars. If you look at the two vehicles side by side, you can, of course, see the similarities, but it's still a pretty far leap to go from one to the next. Kuat Drive Yards was tasked with making this new model combat walker for the new Galactic Empire. The designers of the new walking tank looked back at the AT-TE, which was a decent success for the Grand Army of the Republic, and wanted to address its shortcomings. The primary one being the sheer size of the machine. The TE was a short and squat vehicle. Its 6 legs let it climb reasonably well for what it was, but the extra limbs also meant that it could get hung up on things. The short stature made both high and low obstacles an issue. The AT-AT could walk over ledges and walls as well as cover ravines and wade through rivers. It also fit into the Empire's philosophy by striking fear and awe into anyone who found themselves on the wrong side of these war machines. The machines didn't just have to look big and strong, they had to be big and strong. They were constructed primarily of reinforced durasteel. This alloy was created to resist blaster fire, explosions, and heavy artillery. The durasteel body made the vehicle too heavy for repulsor lifts, which is why these are walking tanks and not hovering like so many vehicles in the Empire's fleet. The legs were not simple metal braces with a swiveling knee joint. The shoulders and knees could swivel. They each had their own flat plate piston drive and braking system. Control systems were found above and below the knee, along with the shock absorbers and piston drive pressurizers. All of this technology was covered up by more reinforced durasteel plating. Even the access panels for servicing the components were so heavily reinforced, there was no weakness to be found. This was important since the AT-AT, while dominant in an assault line, was susceptible to hit-and-run tactics as it was far less maneuverable than most vehicles of war. According to the Ultimate Visual Guide, the head was made compact and off the main body of the vehicle for better surveillance of the battlefield, which would lead to a faster target acquisition and more informed decision-making. The bridge to the head was the only weak point on the entire vehicle. It was composed of a strong metal plating in sequence, held together and allowed to move with ringed electromagnetic systems. Each walker had a pilot and co-pilot. This is also where the commander would be if the walker in question had one stationed aboard. Both pilots received extensive training on every vehicle system, so either one could do the entire job of the other. When in the field, one pilot would run the movement systems and the other one would run the weapon systems. The walker could technically be piloted by a single pilot, but the workload would make the vehicle very inefficient. The head, or cockpit, was loaded with technology. Targeting computers lined the top. The cannons on either side had blaster targeting rangefinders attached to medium blaster cannons. The chin-mounted cannons were Class II heavies with their own power cells. The forward-facing sensors talked to the terrain scanners located in each of the feet. Each foot had the terrain scanners, impulse terrain sensors, and a terrain sensor computer to analyze all that data before sending it to the pilots in the head. The walking assault tanks were more than just a destructive force on the battlefield. The large body of the vehicle offered plenty of storage. The transport bay was 2 levels tall and offered plenty of standing and sitting room for troops. 40 could fit comfortably in each walker. In combat, the troops would line up on the staging area on either side of the vehicle. They would be deployed with a harness and drop line systems that deck officers could rapidly recall to send down the next batch of troops. The tanks were too tall for the speeder bikes to simply drop out. The repulsors wouldn't keep up with the drop and the bikes would be destroyed on impact. Winches were used to deploy speeder bikes onto the battlefield by connecting to the front and back of each vehicle. To power these massive machines, fuel wouldn't be enough. Even starship fuel would be used up relatively quickly under the load inside of a planet's gravitational field. The engines were all powered by an internal power plant. This power plant would supply fuel and energy to the smaller engines engines and servos found throughout the body of the AT-AT. This walker in particular was a good place to start exploring the AT line of walkers. It is the first one Star Wars fans got to see when it made its debut in 1980 in The Empire Strikes Back. It's also the most iconic. The predecessor to the AT-AT was the AT-TE that we already mentioned, the all-terrain tactical enforcer. When the Clone Wars broke out, the Grand Army of the Republic was established and sent into war against the Separatists. The clone troopers were outfitted with armor and weapons, but they needed more. They needed vehicles. One that would have the longest lineage was the AT-TE. The TE became incredibly important for the Republic's war effort. This walker was designed by Rothana Heavy Engineering, which was a subsidiary of Kuat Drive Yards, who would go on to make the rest of the AT Walker line. Rothana worked directly with, and I always trip saying the name in this way, the Kaminoans, to ensure that every vehicle was ideal for the clone troopers and what they needed to accomplish on the battlefield. Where the AT-AT would be redesigned with fear and intimidation on top of the design list, the AT-TE was designed for the Republic. They wanted practicality and functionality over all else. Not just a walking tank, the TE was developed to fit multiple roles on the battlefield at the same time. It was created as an assault vehicle, an artillery vehicle, and a troop transport. The 6 stout legs allowed it to climb on varied terrain. Each leg is powered by independent hydraulics with their own array of sensors and computers to compile all the data before being centralized to the cockpit. These 6 independent systems, working in harmony, made traversing mountains, deserts, snow, ice, and urban areas possible in this insect-like tank. Unlike the AT-AT that would follow, the TE was still small enough for repulsor lift technology to lend a hand its mobility. This came in particularly handy when the vehicles had to make near vertical climbs. The independently articulating legs were strong enough to carry the vehicle, and the repulsors would keep it from falling away from the ground that it was gripping. The walkers were not given energy shields. Instead, they had multiple layers of physical armor constructed of durasteel. This was the same alloy that would be used on the AT-AT, though the material was greatly improved between the Clone War and the War against the Empire. The larger AT-ATs would be given thicker plating. The AT-TEs could withstand blaster fire up to medium grade. Heavy grade or ordnance weapons on a larger vehicle or a starfighter could penetrate the walking tank's hull. Being the first of its kind, the TE was impressive, but it did have some weaknesses that future walkers would try to resolve. The sides, top, and legs of the vehicle got the bulk of the armor. The underbelly was less armored. The designers of the vehicle likely thought any assault would be coming from any of the other directions and left the armor off the belly to save some weight. It's also possible that the repulsor lift systems were located exclusively here, making further arming impossible or they wouldn't function as well. Once the Separatists caught wind of this, they started developing mines and other methods of exploiting it. The slow movement of the vehicle, especially when turning, made quick hits difficult to stop fully. The trooper bays were armored, but the seams in the doors were something of a weakness. When the doors were open, the vehicle could be taken down if a direct hit landed inside. I mentioned the multi-use function of the AT-TE. There was space inside for 20 troops that could be deployed quickly on the battlefield. Along with the troops, supplies, equipment, and small arms could be carried for them. Designed for war against an enemy that was inferior as an individual unit, but had swarms of numbers, the TE had 6 laser cannons mounted all around it. When a swarm of battle droids would assault the clone line, the AT-AT could quickly dispatch the assault from all sides very effectively. For heavier opposition, a massive heavy cannon was mounted to the top of the tank. This long-range artillery could penetrate strong fortifications, armored vehicles, and even starship shields and hulls. Very similar in design to the AT-AT was the AT-ACT, the all-terrain armored cargo transport. This vehicle sacrificed some of the lethality in favor of being a transport and support vehicle. The body of the vehicle was extended for a larger carrying capacity. The armor plating was lessened to allow for the weight to be put into the cargo. This version of the Walker wasn't intended for combat. It would aid in moving goods and troops or on large-scale construction projects. Nearly as iconic as the AT-AT is the AT-ST, also seen in The Empire Strikes Back, but really gets its moment to shine in Return of the Jedi, the all-terrain scout transport. This is one of the Empire's most widely used vehicles. It was not nearly as dangerous as the AT-AT, but much faster and could still do damage against small installations and ground troops. Its fast speed lets it perform scouting tasks, hit-and-run attacks, and also was used as a quick response vehicle on the ever-changing battlefield as needed. It was especially helpful in urban and forested terrain where the larger vehicles could get stuck. AT-STs were often deployed alongside the AT-ATs to reduce enemy hit-and-run tactics against the slower-to-adapt walking fortresses. The Galactic Empire knew their favorite new toy of ground assault intimidation would be slow. They wanted something more agile for patrols and scouting operations. The AT-DP fell somewhere in between the AT-AT and the AT-ST in all ways. It was smaller and faster than the former and packed more of a punch and more armor than the latter. Given its versatility, it was deployed mainly in occupied territories to deter insurrection, or put one down if it happened to arise. It had a single front-mounted heavy blaster cannon. The cockpit was small and required only a single pilot. A co-pilot could cram in if support was needed, but generally one pilot took it out. Given the simplicity of the DP, it was used as a starter walking tank for pilots in training. Like the AT-TE, being the predecessor to the AT-AT, the AT-RT, are you getting confused with these yet? Is the predecessor to the AT-DP, the all-terrain reconnaissance transport. This was a small and highly nimble bipedal walker used by the Grand Army of the Republic during the Clone Wars. The functions were largely the same as the DP we just discussed, with a bit more emphasis put into the reconnaissance aspect. The increased speed did mean less armor, in this case a lot less armor. The cockpit was not enclosed, it left the driver completely open to enemy fire. Despite the risk to the driver, the AT-RT would be sent ahead of larger ground forces to scout the enemy and report back, and it would do what it could to disrupt enemy formations if the enemy were on the move. This design was not done with a lack of caring about the pilot. The vehicle was never intended for prolonged engagements. At roughly 10.5 feet tall, this was one of the smallest walkers ever produced for military purposes. The controls were incredibly basic, so any clone could jump into it and use it. There was no worry about special training or knowledge. Like the larger 4- and 6-legged walkers in the line, the AT-RT's legs were also independently powered and controlled. The articulation made it incredibly stable on all forms of terrain, allowing it to climb reasonably well for a 2-legged walker. On the right surface, the machine could run at 55 miles an hour. Every RT had a medium laser cannon mounted on the front. This was sufficient to take on ground troops and light vehicles. Although open combat was never the intention of the vehicle, some would also be outfitted with a grenade launcher. A small compartment was provided for the pilot to hold field supplies, small arms, or other mission-specific materials. Jumping forward, the follow-up to the AT-AT is the AT-M6, the all-terrain Mega Caliber 6. Designed by the First Order. This walker was significantly larger than the AT-AT. The M6 was not mass-produced. It was created specifically to house and carry the Mega Caliber 6 turbo laser cannon mounted on and in its back. This gun is the namesake of the walking tank. The cannon was so large it required its own power generator and fuel cells to power. The whole walker was built around this cannon. It was a walking siege engine. The front legs were given a different shape, thicker feet, and more weight for stability. The Durasteel armor was replaced with a new ultra-dense but lighter weight composite armor. In addition to the siege cannon that had the power to punch a hole in a planetary shield, the M6 was equipped with dual forward-mounted heavy laser cannons, dual anti-ship medium cannons, and even cable cutters on the legs to prevent a Hoth-like maneuver from taking them down. I love that last little detail that the First Order actually learned from some of the mistakes the Empire made. There are a few other variations on these walkers, but the differences between them are getting smaller and smaller. A few examples are the AT-HS, All-Terrain Heavy Scout, a slightly more armored AT-ST, the AT-AR, All-Terrain Armored Raider, which was a slightly smaller AT-ST, the AT-KT, All-Terrain Kashyyyk Transport, now we're getting ultra-specific, was an AT-AT built to move better in densely forested areas. I hope you learned something new about the all-terrain line of walking tanks. This transmission covers the most major models. As I said, they get more and more specific with less and less differences. If something major is missing, let me know and I'll make sure to do a follow-up. Check out this transmission next for more on the awesome vehicles of the Star Wars universe.